Start now?
So, dear colleagues, participants of the Congress, thank you. Welcome back to plenary room for the last parts of our Congress. And first of all, let me introduce to you the moderator of the session number 3, Mr. Tony Barber, European comment editor of the Financial Times. Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. I imagine your thoughts are drifting towards the conclusion of this conference, but we have an hour and a half to liven it up still more before the end. So the plenary session goes under the title of Levering Long-Term Solutions. And to get us going, we have a keynote speaker who is familiar to many of you already, I suspect. He's the European Commissioner, Mr. Virginijus Sinkevičius. And after his speech, I will ask each one of our panelists, who you will find listed in the program, I won't go through them by name now, to make some observations on the keynote speech. And then we'll kick off a discussion, and I hope to include as many of you in the audience as possible. So there we are. This is how it's going to go, and let's get straight on with it. Mr. Sinkevičius.
Very good morning to all of you. It's, to be honest, a very big pleasure and privilege to be back at this speaking spot, as I served as a member of the parliament for a bit more than 3 years and faced numerous times parliament in talking about some of the legislation that I have proposed as a member of the parliament, as a minister. So it's great to be back, and it's my big honor to welcome you all. And of course have such an important discussion. And I would like to really put a huge word of thank you to organizers and contributors for this extremely meaningful event. And let me start by saying that today we are part of the discussion that is kind of happening all over the world. And that, of course, discussion is central about the security. And people have definitely no shortage of reasons to wish for more security. Security we can understand in very different terms, you know. Financial security, look at the financial crisis of 2008. After that, we really spoke about completely different structure and architecture. Wars in, of course, Syria, Afghanistan, and the following refugee and humanitarian crisis. The COVID pandemics. And finally, of course, Russia's illegal, unjustified war against Ukraine. What do all these events have in common? Two things. First of all, they have put to the test the world order that we know, that we kind of took for granted after the Second World War, how it's framed. It really tested our openness of the world, openness of the financial institutions, borders, supply chains. And many people, many companies struggled in this process due to humanitarian, economic, health reasons. All these events have had a dramatic impact on people all over the world. And secondly, the world failed to prevent these catastrophes, even so that some of them, they were quite known for us for a long time. We were not prepared, lessons had not been learned, and in some cases, we're still failing to learn them. But we can still prevent some of the biggest challenges that we are already facing. And of course, I'm talking about the looming existential threat of climate change and biodiversity loss, and all the associated challenges with it. And that's why many countries are now betting on or fostering green transition. And I talked extensively in the previous session on why the future competitiveness and prosperity of societies depend on successful green transition. Just let me come back to some figures. I apologize to those who already been with me in the previous panel. Around half of the world's total GDP that is roughly 40 trillion euros, is dependent on preserving nature and its ecosystems. And you can always say that, you know, this figure might be coming from the NGOs research or green-minded politicians. No, it's actually coming from the businesses themselves. World Economic Forum, they did a questionnaire of the businesses, how they see the biggest threat in the upcoming 2 years and 10 years perspective. So if you look at 2 years perspective, half, 5 of the biggest threats are linked to climate change, biodiversity loss, ecosystems degradation. 10 years perspective is all about climate change and biodiversity loss. And this is the answers coming from the businesses. And sometimes I feel that discussion is going into that if we implement the Green Deal, if we implement the green transition, there is going to be huge sacrifices. I completely disagree with that. I think it's not about sacrificing anything. In fact, it's about ensuring that the life continues. And now, of course, we always look at the numbers and some will say that's expensive. So let me give you some examples how my cheaper alternative look like. So in 2018, EU's Court of Justice concluded that between 2007 and 2015, Poland broke EU law by exceeding air pollution limits. The main reason is due to abundance of coal, and many people in Poland used it for heating. So coal is cheap, coal is available in Poland, and it might have seemed like a very sound economic reasoning behind that. At the end, Poland had to launch a 28 billion euro program to fight smog. It is estimated that around 48,000 people die prematurely every year due to ailments related to pollution, specifically from coal. So if you look at this story, nothing is cheap, especially considering that you cannot put a price on human life. One more example from Spain, in southeastern Spain, there is a large lagoon named Mar Menor. It used to be a popular tourist attraction, one of the most beautiful places in the world, and today it's called the Green Soup. And its beaches of course are completely lost, they are deserted. In 2016, natural disaster happened, 85% of seabed life died from the pollution. For numerous years now, thousands of dead fish are being washed up on the shore. All of this because of poor sewage management, mining pollution, and fertilizers. While the lagoon remains deserted, Spain has committed close to €500 million to tackle the consequences, among them for the initiative to help local farmers reduce agricultural pollution. And there are many examples as such. Just yesterday, as we are heading into one of the biggest droughts in Europe, Spain announced the emergency measures of 2 billion to help local farmers mitigate the drought consequences. And I think this is, if we do not invest, we always will have to put a larger and larger number at our emergency measures, at the crisis mechanism in our budget line. And I hope that none of the governments want that. But there is also good examples. I don't want to paint a bleak picture, especially we have such a beautiful day today here in Vilnius. We see a huge increase of renewable energy projects, wind power plants covering the North Sea, slowly but surely growing electric vehicle market, which already last year exceeded 10 million in sales, and 15% growth, which was a record growth. We saw a huge increase of solar panels of around 40%, 41% increase of heat pumps, and this is purely citizens' initiatives. They have reacted to what's going on globally, they have reacted to the sparks of the electricity prices, and they look for the solutions. What's most important, they look for the green solutions. We also know about, of course, numerous growing opportunities, and I think what's very important to see the Green Deal and that change as a horizontal change. This is no longer some sort of tree-hugging exercise, but it is about our competitiveness. And for example, the demand for batteries will soon start exceeding the supply. We see in EU that by 2030, the growth of batteries use will increase 14-fold. Plastic recycling market is expected to double around 2031. Most importantly, that will create an opportunities for a secondary raw material market. Some vehicle manufacturers already putting a huge emphasis on hydrogen-powered cars, not even talking about the electric vehicles, which has been now alpha and omega of most of the automotive industries. Precision farming market is expected to triple by the middle of 2030s. Waste management market size should exceed €1 trillion in a decade. Waste, which for many, many years we just saw as an issue, and that would end up in incineration or worse in our forests and fields. Now it's real money. Circular economy, of course, can substantially reduce our dependence on imported materials. And this is a long list which I could name a lot. And change is always scary. I understand that. It's important to ensure and find a balance, solutions for a transition. However, if renewables have taught us anything, is that once we start this journey, acceleration kicks in. Because if you look at the beginning, the cost of electricity of wind turbines was around 30 cents per kilowatt. Now it's 5, and even the plants themselves are finally becoming recyclable. Also, change is happening whether we like it or not. I remember very well when the previous US president, he said that he really likes coal and that coal is going to increase in US in energy use. By the end of his term, the coal has decreased by 24% in energy use in the US, despite the like it or not. So the notion, if we just stick to what we do, everything will remain as it is now, is simply false. So the only choice that we can make are these: whether we invest in the transition and future competitiveness now, or we start the transition later, but also pay a huge bill, buying most of the technologies, importing most of the technologies from the third countries. And this is a choice that every country will make, every continent will do, because when we deal with the climate crisis, when we deal with the biodiversity loss, there is simply no borders. And dealing it within the one region is not going to, of course, help the cause, because at the end of the day, we'll find ourselves at the same balance. Of course, everyone is always free to offer alternatives to the green transition, and we have seen how tremendously it's growing horizontally across many fields. We always say that it has to be successful, it has to be the whole government approach, and that transition has to be fair and just. So not leaving anyone behind. That's the only reason to achieve the success. I want to finalize my short point here, because I'm really looking forward for a great discussion, as we have a great panel here. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I think the Green Deal can ensure, first of all, our strategic autonomy, because we will be sufficient on the resources that we can produce ourselves. The Green Deal can help tremendously as regards our people's health, and that would significantly decrease the pressures from our national budgets, especially the lines for the healthcare, social, and etc. And that would give us a chance not to fall short 1.5 degrees, which is currently a very debatable question. But we can find many other reasons. We can have reasons of more resilient economies, future-proof jobs. We have find the reasons of access to the electricity, better health, food security, of course, cleaner water. And just let me say one thing, that, I do not believe it is a hard sell. It's, first of all, full of opportunities. And everyone can find their landing zone and their opportunities in the green transitions. The transitions, they're happening all the time. Sometimes we don't notice them. Sometimes they are bigger than the others, but it happens all the time. And some industries disappear while the new ones come into place. The most important for us is to not try to catch up something, but to be the ones who form that transition and leads it. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Virginius. So we are now going to have a series of observations, interventions from the panelists on this plenary session. I will introduce them one by one as their turn comes up. We're going to start with Klaus Weller, the Academic Council Chairman of the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies, and of course a former Secretary General of the European Parliament. So, over to you, Klaus.
Yes, thank you very much. I've been asked to speak about leveraging long-term solutions and the possibilities that parliaments can have in this process. So how can parliaments help to leverage long-term solutions? And what is the specific role of the European Union? I would like to say and argue that the European Union is the best chance to get the focus of political actors on the long term. And why is this? First thing is that the European Union has very little to do with the issues of the purse. We are normally not about money, we are not about social security, we are not about taxation, but the European Union in essence is about structural reform to prepare for the mid and for the long term. Second, the European Union is not about consumption, but the European Union is about an investment budget. Our budget is nearly 100% focused on investment. Third, the European Union keeps available very highly qualified multinational staff, which is capable to elaborate for the member states and the European Union innovative proposals and solutions. Fourth, it's true, decision-making procedures are rather slow, but once you have a decision, you can guarantee a large political and geographical consensus behind. And fifth, it allows more than 440 million European citizens to negotiate internationally as equals and from a position of strength. Within the European Union, the Parliament can play a decisive role. The European Parliament, in my nearly 14 years as Secretary General, has tried to provide concepts to institutionalize thinking over the long term and do that systematically rather than accidentally. And I would like to mention 3 or 4 of them. The first is cost of non-Europe. Starting about 10 years ago, we revived the reflection on cost of non-Europe. Originally, cost of non-Europe was used to get the internal market starting, but then it was more or less forgotten. If you can prove that through European regulation, there are potentially hundreds of billions of potentially additional growth without debt, this is a very important factor. In fact, our work inspired very much the incoming Commission under Jean-Claude Juncker 2014. I know that Jean-Claude Juncker, when he was campaigning in Slovakia, somebody gave him our analysis and he said, "That's great, I have a program." So especially I think the push for digital, but also other issues where we claim that there are hundreds of billions out there in potential growth, if we were to regulate this area properly, had a huge impact on the Commission agenda. Of course, to a certain extent, cost of non-Europe is for the optimists among ourselves, but there are also the pessimists, those who are rather focusing on the risk, on the downsides. There's a second tool that was developed in our Parliamentary Research Service under the guidance of the founding General Director Anthony Teasdale, which is about risk, capabilities, and mid-term planning. What it basically does is, with the help of the expertise in our service, but also outside, classifying risk according to 2 criteria. First is a risk less likely to materialize, or rather more likely to materialize? And secondly, if it were to materialize, would the effects only be sectorial, or are they systemic? The fourth quadrant you get out of this with the risk very likely to materialize and with systemic effects has to be taken extremely seriously. The second step is therefore that we try to find out, do we have the capabilities that might be regulatory or that might be financial to deal with those systemic risks very likely to materialize, either on the national level or intergovernmentally or integrated in the European Union. And if you come to the conclusion that you don't, then you better start to set up procedures, legislation or political decisions. That means going through this process, you come to the third phase where more or less this tool leads you to a midterm policy agenda, which is not based on ideology, but on proper analysis of the risks out there, systemic, very likely to happen, the lack of capabilities, and therefore can provide a common basis for all the European Union institutions to develop that midterm agenda. Third, the European Parliament initiated, the rapporteur at the time was James Ellis, so I've already mentioned two British conservatives here in this forum. Unfortunately, Britain has left us. So the rapporteur, James Ellis, who proposed two budgetary amendments, 2010 and 2012, asking for a procedure to be set up on foresight. This has now materialized in the form of ESPAS. ESPAS is bringing together outside researchers, inside capacity, but also the administrative leadership of all the institutions. And over a period of about 10 years, we have now achieved that as an outcome, we have an executive vice president of the European Commission with Maroš Šefčovič, who is responsible for foresight, but better than that, he's also responsible for the annual and multi-annual programming of the Commission, and he is also a huge general directorate with a couple of thousands experts on the most important issues. So that means we have the possibility nowadays in the European Commission to link foresight with external and external expertise and with the annual and multi-annual programming of the Union. We also have a meeting annually of a Council of the Ministers of the Future. So that means it has arrived in the Council. We have in the European Parliament a Vice President of the Parliament responsible for foresight, and nearly all the institutions have now dedicated services or unions which are dealing with foresight on a very regular, very regular basis. To finalize my intervention, in the function I'm now holding as the chair of the Academic Council of the Martin Center, I've inspired a reflection on 7 Ds for sustainability. The 7 Ds are debt, digital, demography, defense, decarbonization, and the de-risking of globalization, as Ursula von der Leyen would call it. The argument I'm trying to make here is that sustainability has to be the guiding principle through all policy areas. So yes, on the environment, but also on defense, also on debt, and the other areas which I've been mentioning. And we are suggesting 175 projects for the next legislature of the European Commission, 2024 to 2029, and have opened a discussion process where everybody can participate. The final project will be available end of the next year. And if you are happy to make contributions, they would be very much welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Klaus. So, time for our second panelist to offer her thoughts. It's Daniela Tilbury, Commissioner for Sustainable Development and Future Generations of the Government of Gibraltar. Daniela.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the opportunity to join you, unfortunately virtually, because of our current elections locally. Let me just clarify that I am speaking on behalf of the network of institutions and leaders for future generations, rather than as a commissioner for Her Majesty's Government of Gibraltar, just to clarify that important aspect. Let me start by saying that we all know we're living in a very interesting time. We are facing challenges that are complex, connected, and somehow blinding the future which is ahead of us. It is really obstructing our view to have a clear idea of where the future might be leading us. We have very dramatic reports coming out of the International Panel for Climate Change. We have dire statistics coming out in regards to mental health and disease, and we are being challenged not just physically or mentally, but also in terms of our human development aspect. We know that poverty, deprivation, access to education, all these issues that are shaping not just our current societies, but our ability to live a better life in the future. When the term future generations first appeared in the international global governance scene, it did so under the Brundtland Report, which spoke about the importance of linking environment development in ways that resolves and addresses these issues so that we could live and ensure a much better planet for the future generations. So for me, all these issues are so interconnected that they're indivisible. When we talk about foresight, when we talk about the future, we must certainly bear in mind that a future is not just created in a space that is blind or that is abstract, but that requires us engaging very positively with our communities now so that we can realize this much brighter future. Now, having said all of this, I think that having heard the speeches as well today and some of them yesterday, I realized that sometimes our global governance systems, our political frameworks, very much focus on resolving the issues of today. And so we are again blindsided, not because we can't see the future, but because we are attempting to resolve the problems of today in such a focused manner that we seem to disconnect it from creating alternative pathways to the future. So sometimes I talk about the fact that our parliaments, our parliamentary frameworks, very much act as mirrors in our society, reflecting what is good and bad in our everyday lives, when in fact, what would be very worthwhile, very valuable, and in my context needed, is parliamentary frameworks, governance principles that very much serve as beacons in our community so that we can construct that much brighter future. We have heard from our colleague that the European Commission is ideally placed to be able to put these governance frameworks in place. And that is terrific because I've seen through the Green Deal and through a number of other initiatives, particularly in education, how this much joined up approach to futures thinking, to addressing future generation challenges are being slowly put in place. But what we require now is vision, a vision, and enthusiasm, vision, positivity, a worldview that is encouraging, that speaks about what is possible, rather than how we are going to be addressing just the issues that are facing us on a day-to-day basis. Because we need the motivation, because we need to get excited about this vision of the future that will be fairer, that will be more accessible, that will be healthier, that will be safer, that will be more predictable in some ways, as we try to ensure that there is a greater connectivity between all the issues that face us. So in summary, I think what I'd like to stress is the importance of ensuring that we have vision in our global governance frameworks and not just steps to resolve the current issues that face us. When we talk of climate change, for example, let's imagine what a climate-safe environment globally might look like. Let's identify the physical traits, the social engaging aspects of this vision, and let's work backwards from that rather than forwards from a problem-solving angle. For me, it's really important that the long term is not just a series of steps from here to there, but that we work backwards from something that is positively engaging, enthusiastically seeking to reach those who are yet to understand the potential of this long-term thinking on our everyday lives. My final comment goes to education, an area that's very close to my heart. And I know that my colleagues at the network of institutions and leaders for future generations are also very committed to. We want to just raise awareness, also educate so that we can lead thoughts and decisions for future generations and their interests. But we want to also be a voice of organizations, leaders and institutions that can support parliaments, that can support governing bodies to ensure that future generations are embedded within decision-making, between resource allocation, but also that spaces are created for the younger generation to be able to shape our visions of the future. And I leave it there. Thank you very much to the organizers for this invitation, and my apologies for not being there in person today.
Well, thank you for joining us from Daniela at what one could describe as sort of the opposite corner of the continent. Thank you very much for all your observations. Now, let's move to panelist number 3. She is Sophie Howe, Sustainability, Futures and Wellbeing Advisor and the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. Sophie.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you here today, and also to follow Daniela as I was the chair of the Network of Institutions for Future Generations, and as you heard, the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. I think that there are many things that I agree with Daniela on there, particularly on the issue in terms of setting a vision. Arguably, we do have a vision for the world that we want to leave behind to future generations, set out through our Sustainable Development Goals. But I think there are some significant challenges in terms of actually localising those goals and making them relevant to people within each country and indeed with each community. We're also seeing a significant shift in many countries towards measuring what matters, recognising some of the huge challenges we're seeing in terms of wealth inequality, recognising the damage that a focus purely on GDP has done to our planet, and recognising that citizens themselves want our governments to measure their quality of life and their well-being rather than just those narrow measures. In some countries, we're also seeing the embedding of anticipatory governance. So we've heard from colleagues about the use of foresight, future scenarios and trends. I think that the big challenge here is that those three areas are often not being brought together. That's exactly what we have tried to do in Wales, and I want to give you an outline of the approach that we've taken. First of all, we held a national conversation with our citizens, posing the question, what is the Wales you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren, and future generations to come? That enables citizens to tell us about their dreams, sometimes tell us about their nightmares for their future generations, generations, but having that dialogue and getting citizens in that space is critically important for us to set a vision as a country. Now, you wouldn't think it was revolutionary for a country to have a long-term vision, and ours is actually set out in law, but it's completely revolutionary because most countries only operate from one electoral cycle to the next, and that is why we're in these really challenging situations in terms of not having taken the long-term actions we need on climate, not dealing with biodiversity loss, not intervening early enough and still not intervening early enough on AI and the changing nature of work and so on, because all of those issues span beyond our short-term electoral cycles. There's also something about having a vision that we can work towards, because when we're asking people in our systems to apply foresight and to apply future generations thinking, often what we're seeing is that is all based on risk. And it's based on a kind of often a dystopian future. You've only got to log on to Netflix and plug into any program about the future, and you will get a dystopian vision. And it's critically important that we are moving beyond that dystopia to saying that a positive vision for our futures is possible, and a positive vision which is co-created with citizens is possible. A positive vision which is co-created with children and young people, those who are closest to those yet to be born, is absolutely possible. So in Wales, from that citizen dialogue, we set out 7 long-term well-being goals, and those are set out in law. Each one of our public institutions, our government, our local authorities, our health institutions, our national agencies have duties to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all 7 of those well-being goals. And that point around the integration across all of those well-being goals, as well as duties to prevent problems from occurring or getting worse, to apply anticipatory governance, so long-term thinking, take into account the long-term trends or scenarios that will either accelerate progress in a positive way to meeting those goals or take us away from progress, and how do we act on those things, and then to collaborate with each other and have an ongoing involvement of citizens. That is not just in some aspirational policy document in Wales, that is set out in our law. So that for me is the second element of what is crucial if we are really going to focus on acting in the interests of future generations. It's not enough for there to be platitudes, it's not enough for us to say that that's what we want to do. It must be legally mandated on our governments to do that, because the reality is that despite the fact that we do have information about climate change, we do have information about all of these challenges coming our way, our systems have failed future generations in terms of a failure to act. So that mandate on our politicians is absolutely essential. The third area, which I think is essential, is building skills, capacity and capability within the infrastructure. So within our governments, within our civil servants service and our government officials. If you've grown up in many of, or if you've developed your career within many of those institutions, you will have probably been performance managed on the basis of delivering short-term targets. You will have been held to account on whether you're bringing spending within an annual budget. You will have been moved throughout different departments, so actually what you do in one department or what you don't do in one department you might never have to deal with the consequences of. And we need to have a fundamental rethink in terms of how we think about the skills, capacity of our civil servants to deliver integrated, joined-up policy making, applying a long-term lens. Now, we've heard lots of good examples of where that's happening, but it is incredibly challenging because, and there's something here for our politicians and also for our media in terms of allowing our systems and encouraging our systems and indeed in mandating our systems, providing them resources to actually do this long-term thinking, the skills to do foresight, future trends and so on. The fourth area that I think is critically important is external challenge. Our law, and I have to say that, and I'm pleased that Sinead Williams and Jenny Rathbone are here from Wales, some of whom were part of passing this groundbreaking legislation, because it is a brave government who not only puts these statutory requirements upon themselves, but also establishes an independent role to hold them to account on whether they're actually delivering that legislation. And again, I think that independent accountability is critically important, because we can see that we've got a lot of these things in place in different countries, and still we are not making the decisions in a way which is fit for future generations. I am aware, of course, that there are so many committees of the future here, and those committees in parliaments that have a role in scrutinising government, and that's critically important. But actually, this is about going within government to really identify very early on how these principles are being applied to policy making, rather than perhaps just critiquing them after the policies have been made. So I think that we have a model that could be a useful model for other parts of the world. I want to say, give you some examples of what that has changed in Wales. And, you know, we are not perfect. We are 7 years into this cycle of having a Future Generations Act. And I describe it as the biggest cultural change programme Wales has ever seen, because you can have a law, you can put processes in place, but unless you have all of these additional elements, capacity building within the civil service, external challenge, and so on, you're not necessarily going to see the progress. But we have seen progress in some significant areas in Wales. We have reformed the way that we're thinking about transport planning, applying a lens of how can you think about transport in a way which meets our 7 wellbeing goals to meet decarbonisation targets, to improve the health of our citizens, to build more cohesive communities, and to address social inequity. So instead of spending money on building more roads, we are shifting our spending to investment in public transport and active travel, because that makes long-term sense across those 7 wellbeing goals. We've reformed our school curriculum so that the skills that our young people are being taught in schools are skills which are fit for the future. Moving beyond rote learning, knowledge is perhaps a thing of the past, because you know, even in the last 5 to 10 years, if we want to know anything, we're Googling it, and from this point on, we'll be asking ChatGPT to do that work for us. And actually, those are signals that have been there for quite some time, that what we need to do to prepare our children and young people for the future is focus on the skills which will enable them to go on and undertake the jobs of the future, but also to have a life well lived. So emotional intelligence, cooperation, teamwork and empathy, critical thinking, those are skills which cannot be delivered to young people in the way that traditional education systems work. So in Wales, we have transformed our curriculum to base the outcomes of our curriculum around creating healthy, active and confident learners, ethical and informed citizens, creative and enterprising citizens, and those principles are absolutely crucial for the future. Imagine if every one of us in this room had been through an education system that equipped us to be ethical and informed citizens. We may not be in a climate crisis that we're in at the moment. We've also seen some huge progress in terms of our approach to reaching zero waste. Wales, as a tiny country, is 3rd in the world for its rates of recycling, and we have aspirations to be a zero waste nation by 2050. But in reaching that target of being a zero waste nation, we are also bringing in other long-term trends, like the breakdown in communities, like long-term trends around intergenerational poverty. So the way in which we're approaching reaching zero waste in a joined-up preventative way is by focusing on developing things like the library of things, where people in communities can come together to borrow and share equipment that they might otherwise buy. That's reducing our carbon emissions, it's reducing reducing our use of resources, it's bringing communities together, and it's saving people money. Things like community repair cafes. The point that I'm trying to make here is that what we need to do if we are genuinely going to be applying anticipatory governance is that we need to apply a long-term well-being lens to every policy decision that we take. We need to be joining up our system. We need to be focused on embedding future generations thinking, long-term planning and integration within our system if we are going to ensure that we are leaving the world for future generations better than we found it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Some trenchant thoughts there on the need for long-term planning. So, our fourth speaker, Taylor D. Hawkins from the United Nations Foundation Unlock, or the United Nations Foundation Unlock Advisor, I should say. Over to you, Taylor.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to speak along such an esteemed group of speakers. I will keep my remarks short as I am keen for us to engage in quite an interactive conversation after these contributions, but I'm coming at this from a slightly different capacity to a lot of you as sitting at the UN Foundation. I've done a lot of comparative study of different countries' approaches, and so what I hope to share today is, as we look to leverage long-term solutions, just 4 observations that I've made of what we need to be successful in implementing these long-term solutions on a domestic level. So the first of which would be is that we are trying to design a seatbelt for a crash or crashes that we can't anticipate what it looks like, which means that the solutions that we need to design have to be responsive and agile. I was having a conversation just yesterday with a colleague at this event, and we discussed that there is such a desire to create high detail and to define everything to the highest level, but really what we need to do is to create layers of infrastructure that can respond to the subjectivity, to the changing nature of our world, because legislation created a year ago, 2, 3, 4 years ago would not be and is not suitable to respond to what we're seeing now with, as was mentioned, AI, ChatGPT, etc. So being prepared for the fact that we need to be leveraging foresight and anticipatory governance practices in a way that is flexible and empowers our leaders to be flexible as well. The second point would be that we need to reconcile with the complexity of the task of parliamentarians, which is to serve present-day constituencies that might not always fully understand and fully be ready to embrace the needs of the long term. I think it is a privilege, and once again, speaking with another colleague at this event, it is a privilege for us to get to sit in this room and be concerned about the long term. And that privilege comes with responsibility, but we cannot expect all citizens to have the mental and emotional capacity to think about 100 years from now when maybe their immediate day-to-day is their largest concern. And so how can we reconcile that difficulty as we hope to encourage more participatory elements to our democracies? The third point is that no one size fits all. As was just mentioned, localization is so important in this process, and that means taking into consideration the social, economic, and cultural landscape, the demographic trends of the country. I understand that Italy versus Nigeria will need to have deeply divergent strategies in how they handle the next 100 years due to the aging trends in their populations. And this also means being cognizant of the historical context and debts that each country owes to each other. And my specific reference here is not financial, it is environmental, it is ethical, it is moral, and as a result of that, financial to a degree. I've had the chance to speak with some incredible Indigenous academics and elders from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and what I hear time and time again is we cannot hope to create this vision of the future that many of us postulate without reconciling with the truth of our history. And as an Australian, and I believe that many other countries are in this position, I really reinforce that that is essential for powerful long-term solutions. And the last observation that I would make is that long-term solutions require long-term journeys, and that I would hope that we could all bounce straight to where Wales is or where other countries that are taking fantastic strides are at, but it's a journey, it will be iterative, there will be a learning curve, and the process of localization will potentially include trial and error hopefully with mitigated risks, but that we have to consider the broadest spectrum of the tools at our disposal for protecting future generations. That might be commissioners, it might be constitutional reform, legislative reform, or entirely new legislation. It can also be things that aren't explicitly branded as future generations initiatives. There's a lot of foresight work that currently goes uncredited as foresight work, which limits the engagement that we get in these conversations, whereas if we can broaden that and invite more people in and empower them to realize that their capacities can be used in this space, the team with which we are working becomes far greater. And I will conclude my points there, but I'm very excited to hear from the rest of our panelists and then to hear from everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taylor. Well, for our fifth panelist, we're going to have a shift of perspective. We're going to hear how things look from South America. The fifth speaker is the chair of the Special Committee on the Future of the General Assembly of Uruguay, and he is Rodrigo Garnier Reyes. Rodrigo.
Thank you. After having heard during yesterday and this morning about the relevance and urgency Ukrainian situation represents for the democracy in the future, I want to share a couple of thoughts concerning the next World Summit of Committee of the Future we will organize in Uruguay, South America, from the 25 to 27 on September this year, with Interparliamentarian Union to discuss the democracy of the future. As you know, we live in any desk this invitation. Of course, I extend a warm invitation to participate in that. But let me tell you a short story, a previous story of this summit. In last October, last year, at the end of the first World Summit of the Committee of the Future in Helsinki, as Maria Joisa is a good witness about it, we had to decide where will be the next summit. And of course, we suggested to meet in January, 1 year after, and in Latin America, because future will be also in the other part of the world. And at the same time, remember Raimondas. Raimondas proposed to have a meeting before, because the situation of Ukraine, and he proposed to organize in Lithuania in May. And we agree to organize both. And after this day, I think the fact demonstrates we were both right too. This Global Parliament Congress have invited to discuss issues that are relevant to our society and to focus on the importance of Ukrainian situation and, of course, Europe's situation, not just the present, but also for the future. And I think it has been fruitful in this way. But as we know, the world is facing a numerous, complex, and simultaneous challenges, as the panelist said. We are living in a context, in a polycrisis, with the threat of maybe a irreversible tipping point in many systems, not just political, but also social, economic, and others. To address these issues and threats, we urgently need to change the paradigm and strategies of governance. So we need to work on the strengthening of social and parliamentary anticipatory capabilities, as, of course, many parliamentarians are working on. And as we live in a world complex interdependence, we think the other key pillars is inter and transdisciplinary work. We need to work closer between many regions, disciplinary, building together shared meaning from Europe, from Latin America, from Africa, anticipatory shared sense through collective intelligence, knowledge creation. And the future committees of parliament and the future committee of parliament had proven to be very useful for that purpose. As the Chancellor of the Lithuania said last night at the dinner, the artificial intelligence and other emerging technology are transforming everything and challenging traditional model of governance and transforming decision-making, participation, and administration policy. As you know, on late this month, the development of artificial general intelligence, or artificial intelligence at least, posed unprecedented challenges for democracy. On the one hand, of course, as you know, has the potential to revolutionize in a positive way democratic processes, but on the other, it could also pose significant risks if especially not properly managed. So, because of that, we think we need an anticipatory global governance, artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, a task as difficult and complex, but as necessary to preserve democracy and the fundamental human values. Democracy of the future is an extremely important issue we need to think about. In particular, now, the challenge that artificial intelligence implies in the intersection with other technology and problems that are impacting in pluralism, freedom, and sovereignty. We are imagining a global ecosystem of anticipatory governance, sharing best practice, as now, and promoting collaboration among nations with a strong participation of parliament. I am inviting to our next summit in Montevideo, because we strongly believe with other Uruguayan parliamentarians that are participation with us, because it's this kind of event, like the former World Summit in Finland, and this Global Parliament Congress, and the following ones, really contribute to build democracy of the future. That need to face, of course, the attack to Ukraine, the situation of Ukraine, but also other global and emerging challenges like technological challenges. To address both objectives, both the situation now in Ukraine, because of the relevance to the democracy in the future, and the other objective, we look forward to seeing you next September, 25 to 27 in Uruguay. It will be worth it. So I hope will you see in Uruguay soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Well, I suspect there won't be any shortage of people hoping to take you up on that invitation to South America. So let's move on. Our sixth speaker, the Director for Innovation in Science and Policymaking at the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission, and she is Jolita Butkiewicz. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak following Senor Rodrigo Reyes. And it's no wonder that we have, I saw we had Chile participating and we have Uruguay next to. If you look into South America context, it's the most democratic country, the most equal country, and it's really a huge pleasure, I think, to have you in this small country. And considering that Uruguay is another small country, we feel like friends.
Yes.
The advantage is I do not need to tell you what we do in European Commission, in European Union, because Secretary General Klaus Welle just very eloquently did that. So I will just exchange with you, if I may, my surprise of how much meeting of minds I encounter during these 2 days. And it does come as a surprise, and I would really like to thank Professor Lopata for bringing us together here. That definitely is your convening power, to give us hope. And my hope is in how we all concerned are about the state of democracy. Of course, I speak from European Commission's perspective. We spoke a lot about democracy yesterday, and even in the morning we did the same thing. We spoke about participatory rates. Do you have any idea of the party affiliation in Europe? The average for Europe is 5% of the population that are participating in one or another formal party. And then you count on top of it the dwindling rates of voters that come to vote for local, national, or European elections. We see that we have an issue. We also see not only the decreasing numbers, again, we see the generational tendencies where we have, why we are talking about young people. Because, they are busy, they don't have time to vote. It's the older generation that tends to vote, which you rightly said, they tend to be more conservative. So do our policies really take into account all the citizens? Is our democracy really democratic? And this is an important moment for all institutions, and I'm really reassured that we are all recognizing this, that the institutions need to demonstrate that democracy works, that we can have more democracy because it will deliver, as you rightly said, more well-being, and it will address fairness. I was very surprised my colleagues in this big institution of 3,000 scientists did one of those surveys, and they found that people, yes, they do care about inequalities, but much more about fairness. So this is the task for us as institutions to demonstrate. And what we also realize, listening to all of us, that we need to have this intergenerational view of the world. Not easy, it does not come naturally, we live today. Is it doable from the policy making? Okay, now I will say something about Europe. 2 things. We did it. We have a commitment to the Green Deal, thank you, Commissioner, which will last until 2050. So we have a framework that Europe will not go away from. We have this long-term commitment, and we will deliver on the really climate change, addressing these issues in one way or another, because it is grounded. So it is doable, but then I come to what really defines us Europeans. When you think Europe, it's the social contract. And the question that I have, is the social contract on which Europe was built, and it still was built in the 20th century, is fit for the 21st century? Well, if we speak so much about sustainability, probably it's more just another issue outside. The sustainability has to be built into the social contract if Europe wants to be relevant and it really wants to respond to the needs and interests of its citizens today and tomorrow. We also lived through complex years, and I will mention here COVID, because it is in the past. WHO told us it's in the past. We trust WHO. What did we learn? And did we adopt these lessons into our policy making? Or we said, check out, we out of the woods. Well, if you would allow me, well, not that you have much of a choice, I would mention 2 points. One, I'll make a case for science, and another case I'd like to make for values. We want policies that work, that are sustainable, not only today, but also tomorrow, and we want them to be informed by science. We want this scientific evidence to be systematic, not one-off when we did it for COVID. And we want them to be embedded in the policy-making cycle. Okay, I will now complain about the scientists with whom I work. They do think they need to be very independent and sit in their golden tower. We need to overcome that. Science has to become part of the society. And science has to be available to the policymakers in the understandable form, please, but also at the moment that the policymakers need it to take their decisions. We need to provide this unbiased, future-proof, socially sensitive evaluation and, as you rightly said, impact of different policy proposals, including in their implementations, and also help to devise solutions that would work. Why it is also important? It could help, not that it will solve, but could help to distinguish facts from pure politics in the public debate. Now, I will move to another point. So you have scientifically proven position. Are we sure that our citizens will follow? We need to offer what our citizens want. And if the values on the basis of which we shape policies do not correspond to the values of citizens, then the futures we are constructing with these policies will not be neither resilient nor sustainable. And in the quicksands of misinformation, it is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that every time citizens oppose something we stand for, we defend, we say, as policymakers, they are misinformed. And, well, our duty is to correct them. A spoiler, but how can we distinguish then misinformed opinions from legitimately different opinions, which are based on the same trustworthy information? Okay. Mr. Lopato, you have to invite me next time, I'll answer. So, the inference that I would make that evidence-informed policymaking by itself is important, but is not sufficient to really entice, to convince people that policies that we are offering, that we are defending, that we are devising are good, if they will not be in accordance with the political views and values that citizens stand for. Now, the only solution that I heard this morning, and I came just for that, is a very simple, offer participatory approach. I was talking to my nephew. My analysis is always based either on my son or my nephew. There is one and another one, so they're scientific. And I said, but Lithuania is doing so well, look at the economy. And he says, but this is not working, and this is not working. And they, meaning the government, they just don't listen. They don't ask. So you were right, let's ask. One small thing, please watch the screens for Brussels. We will be putting forward defense of democracy ideas for member states to consider and to take forward in the very short future. So this illusion of participation is called deliberative democracy and would create these spaces for ordinary citizens and other interested participants to be involved in policy and decision-making systematically. So far in the EU, we're working on guidelines how to do it. Is always the fear of using it as a populistic tool, and how do you make it a real tool that would really make a difference? When citizens put forward the request to work on food waste in the European Commission, do you know how our colleagues reacted? Well, I will not give you names, but none of them was happy. They said, what is this? With all the things happening, we have to work on something like this? You know, we really need these genomes, you know, IT and all these, and you want us to work? Yes, yes. And when I went to my survey, my son, and I said, do you think it's important? He looked at me as I'm from the Mars. He said, but of course it's the most important thing. So it's not so easy, but participatory democracy is creeping in, and we hope it will make a difference. We do take no sides fits all. Each cultural context will guide implementation of this principle, but so far, that's the only thing we have. So next question, and we spoke a lot about, we didn't speak enough. I discovered something in my portfolio, which is called foresight. I have not had this portfolio for a long time, so it is quite interesting for me to realize, and I ask myself, why, when I was in my previous life, I couldn't care less about foresight. I was so busy with my life that I really didn't. It makes sense, it makes sense. So how do we bring this long-term view into our policymaking? How come policymaking is not transactional? It needs to respond to day-to-day needs. So, and suddenly I realize that strategic foresight provides the safe space to think, then thinkable. And I think it's the safe space where probably Uruguay will be leading us towards finding certain solutions, even for multilateral fora or global fora. So looking ahead gives us the agency to prepare, adapt, and probably prevent some of the most undesirable outcomes. And there are tools. We mentioned a few of them, scenarios, horizon scanning. Horizon scanning, which detects signals of change and emerging trends and try to make sense of the possible evolution. It is a critical capacity. And I would like to be provocative and give you a flavor of what it can bring. I don't know how many of you have been exposed to horizon scanning. We all know about the water shortages, especially if you do not live in Brussels. It's a joke because it's raining now since 7 days. The water shortages we recognize. Now, what does the recent horizon scanning show us? That in the coming decades, there is a possible crisis over second most used resource in the world, which is sand. Modeling exercise show 45% increase in global sand use due to construction sector from 2020 to 2060. And if you look into United Nations Environmental Program released report in April last year, it is warning us that extraction of sand exceeds the replenishment rates, leading to shortages, socioeconomic conflicts, and potential environmental degradation. Who is addressing this issue? Lunar economy. Lunar economy encompasses all general economic activity associated with production, use, and exchange of lunar resources on the moon's surface. And it's already in the news. It is happening in lunar orbit and on Earth. It has estimated in terms of values by 2040, which is basically tomorrow, $170 billion US. We have other tools, mega trends that are visible today, expected significant impact tomorrow, aggravating resource capacities and so forth. So I will not dwell into our insights on mega trends or developing foresight scenarios, which we also try to do. We try to do positive. Nobody asks us to do the negative. Nobody asks us to see what is the scenario if we don't deliver on 2050 Green Deal in Europe. So there are tools that could equip policymaking. What we really, really need is that our policymakers become future literate, that they must have the competence to spot the change and direct the change. Provide evidence to inform policymaking. I need also to train our scientists to link the dots, formulate the issues, and communicate the relevance to science in a convincing way to policymakers. And then certainly we have to assess impact of all policy proposals in the future perspective. We need those models that would offer us this cross-cutting social criteria and bring in foresight considerations. Does it make sense? Anybody disagrees with me? So my question, why is it that we are not doing enough? Thank you.
Many thanks, Julita. So, our final panelist from Finland, Vera Heinonen, Director of Democracy Engagement, Finnish Innovation Fund. Over to you, Vera.
Thank you very much. And the advantage of being the last panelist is that a lot of things that I meant to say have been already said. So I will be very brief so we can open the discussion with the audience. But I will start with something that was stated already yesterday, and there will be no green transition unless our democracies survive and thrive. And that is really stating the obvious, but I think we really need to get back to that basic idea that autocracies will not do it. Hybrid democracies will not be leading the way in green transition. It will be democracies. And I think our democracies will only thrive and tackle in these times of seminal transitions if we recognize and realize the need to reform our representative democracies, our democratic institutions, and our democratic infrastructure, and give people real and direct opportunities to participate, because this is what we are seeing, obviously. As Olita mentioned, only 5% of the European public are affiliated with parties. We're seeing less people turn out when we have elections, particularly European elections. So we need different ways and direct ways of participation. And we also need to give people the opportunity to shape the agenda, and not only turn on the question that people are not necessarily interested or don't have the capacity. I agree that people are, obviously citizens are tackling their day-to-day issues, but if we design the processes correctly, or if we invest in the process design, I think we could see a difference on people turning up and giving their opinion and voice when it comes to the agenda shaping. When it comes to these transformative societal transitions, such as the green transition, we do have encouraging examples from Europe. And I would point out that the European Climate Assemblies, we had some great successes and not so successful ones, but the main thing is that we can learn from the panels and assemblies that were held. And I found most striking from these experiences was particularly the research made from the Climate Assembly UK, what kind of impact it had on the participants' climate views and actions and their behavior. And this was regardless of their background or political affiliation. And for citizens panels, I think a great argument to be made, or deliberative democracy, is that these are randomly selected panels. So we don't have only the active citizens turning up. We really have a good sample of the electorate that we are dealing with. So finally, a big thank you to the organizers in investing in these future discussions and debates, because these are not easy to have and they don't give quick rewards or quick fixes or easy headlines, but these are the fundamentals that we have to build our democracies on. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Vera. You certainly kept your word and said all that very succinctly, leaving plenty of time for us to hear the thoughts of those of you in the audience. Before I invite questions, I'd like to mention something that struck me listening to the 7 panelists, and that is earlier this year on this question of how to build in a long-term approach to these various challenges. Earlier this year, a short but very interesting book was published by the Polish-born thinker Jan Zielonka. It's called The Lost Future. And the point he makes in the book is that in democracies, the difficulty of managing challenges in time and space are such that the nation state seems an inadequate mechanism to face these things. In the question of time, I think it was Taylor who touched on this, maybe one or two others. The electoral cycle is such that it is hard for democratically elected politicians to put more emphasis on the longer term rather than the shorter term. And then in terms of space, it might seem self-evident that various challenges extend beyond national borders, but they're not just to do with obvious ones like climate change, but I would mention, for example, systemic financial crises, and they are, in the future, in my view at least, going to be a lot more difficult to manage than, say, the one in 2008, because of the advance of technology in the meantime, so they can just, like in a flash, around the world, So, in any event, the point Jan Zielonka is making is that how can nation states get round the problem that they on their own aren't going to be able to deal with these things. He proposes not just international cooperation at the level of states, but also the greater involvement of governmental, what we might call sub-national governmental organizations, and also NGOs. He suggests they might be more flexible, more imaginative, less hidebound and bureaucratic procedures and so on. It's a very interesting book. I recommend it to you if you haven't come across it yet. There we are. Who would like to put a question to one of the 7 panelists? Let me see. I guess the best thing would be to raise your hand if you'd like to. I'm a little bit short-sighted, so I'm not sure I can. Where are we? Let's. All right. What I'm going to do in that case, unless I missed it, I'm going to ask. Well, let me start, since Vera was the shortest in terms of time speaker. Of the 7. Let me put a question to you, Vera. One issue that was only marginally touched on, I felt, in the 7 panelists' remarks, was that of finance. Now, in the future, there's going to be, or already one might say, a whole load of competing demands for how governments, democratically elected, are going to spend money. It isn't just about climate change. I mean, in the context of the current situation in East Central Europe, it's about defense, it's about upgrading infrastructure, huge amounts of money to be spent on that. One could mention which one or two of the speakers did, the need to modernize and make more effective the European welfare state model. All of this costs a huge amount of. How can we make sure that money gets spent in the right way, and that enough of it does go to the green transition, Vera?
Yeah, that's a good point, because most of our governments are still organized in different silos. So, we obviously have different, budgets for defense or health services and so forth. And if we look at these mega trend challenges, we would need them to go across the board and look at, for instance, national resilience. And then it becomes a question of defense, health, well-being, and green transition, that we have an environment to live in. And this goes back to what we discussed in an earlier panel with the Scottish parliamentarian Sarah. Sorry, I missed your last name now, but Sarah pointed out that in Scotland they have this well-being bill that is looking at these questions in a holistic manner. And this is, again, goes to our design of our governments and our democratic infrastructures, that we're not good at tackling these issues when we're still going back to the different departments and have the finances allocated to these different departments. So I think, Tony, one thing might be that these issues are becoming so big that they are forcing us to change the way we budget and operate. And I'm hopeful that that will come soon. And it goes to the design questions, what Taylor was talking about before as well.
Very good. Thank you, Vera. I see that Sophie would like to come in and offer some thoughts on this point. Sophie.
Yeah, I think it's building on what Vera was saying, actually, that how we need to test our spending decisions is we need to have a vision of where we're going. The approach that we take is that we should choose to prioritise the things that make the biggest contribution to our long-term well-being goals. So perhaps I could give you a scenario there. If our mission is to decarbonise the transportation system, then mass investment in electric vehicles, grants, EV infrastructure and so on might be a sensible thing to do. It would certainly help to decarbonise the transportation system. If, however, we have a holistic set of measures, so we don't just want to decarbonise the transportation system to meet our carbon emissions targets. We want to improve the health of the nation. We want to tackle inequality. We want to bring communities together, and so on. Actually, if you apply a long-term lens to all of the trends in those areas and you apply reaching of those long-term well-being goals, then actually investing in EV to decarbonise the transportation system is not a sensible thing to do at all. Because what we end up doing then is we're all still sat in congestion, adding to an obesity crisis in our electric vehicles rather than our diesel vehicles. We're not talking to our neighbours and our communities. The poorer people in our communities who couldn't afford diesel vehicles certainly won't be able to afford electric vehicles. And so the way in which we spend the money there, actually a much more sensible solution, if you're to apply those well-being lenses to your policy decisions, is to invest in public transport, better walking, cycling and active travel. So I think there are the challenges of our system. It's silo-based, so often meet that challenge of decarbonising your transport system and we talk to a load of highways engineers because that's the way that we do business. It's based on an old model. Don't talk to the health practitioners, don't talk to the people who work with communities, don't talk to people who might be experiencing poverty. So we need to widen up that conversation, and this brings in those points around that kind of citizen engagement. And then we need to apply long-term trends in a holistic manner as well. Not just long-term trends in how we meet our decarbonisation targets, but long-term trends on ageing, on inequality, on health, and so on. And I think that that is the magic, really, of long-term and integrated policy making. It's just that it's incredibly difficult to do. But you know, our framework, I suppose, in Wales is certainly helping us to move towards that. And I think it's something that, that every part of the world should be considering, how they can apply long-term trends in a holistic way to every decision they take, including how they spend their money.
Thank you, Sophie. I've just had it whispered in my ear from the organisers that we're going to close this session at 12:45, which leaves us just under 15 minutes to go. But we do have a question from the audience. If you could introduce yourself and then put the question to the panel.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Maria Karapetian. I'm a parliamentarian from Armenia, and I would like to pose my question for Madam Butkevichiene. You raised our curiosity, mine in particular, about this point you made about differentiating informed citizens from uninformed citizens, or supposedly uninformed citizens from legitimately value-driven positions among those citizens. I would like to seize this opportunity to actually pose this question to you and invite you to tell us and inform us a little bit if there is a way to tell one from the other. My personal position comes from, is identical probably to a French philosopher's position on this. Jacques Rancière is the name of the philosopher, and in his book called The Uninformed Schoolmaster, or something of the sort, he argues that all intelligence is equal. and we should derive our sense of democracy based on this premise and see how democracy will unfold if we treat all intelligence as equal. And maybe a second question, if I may, bridging this to what our moderator said about nation states and the acceleration of time. There is this argument that because of technology, time has accelerated so much that our public institutions have lost all opportunity to catch up with their decision-making processes with the world unfolding in front of our eyes. I love the concept of deliberative democracy, but it takes even more time to do this. Do you see a way of how public institutions, democratic public institutions, can perhaps catch up with this and with the acceleration of technology? Because the view that's being painted is that soon, just like the subjects of empires turned into citizens of nation states, soon we will see everyone turning into users of technology and technological corporations, and citizenship will become outdated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yolita, your thoughts on that?
Thank you. And I will not dwell too much. I will just basically give you the quick answer. If you have one informed or two positions which are completely diametrically opposite, right? You meet someone who hates climate, who is advocate for climate change and is a non-believer. You give the scientific evidence, you give the same article to the two of them to read. Do you think they will come in agreement after having read the same article? In fact, their entrenched positions can even become more disparate. So, because it is not the mind, but it's something that is much deeper that guides the appeal and the thinking and the values. That's what I was talking about, the values. But there is a culprit saying there, Mario, he will come back to you to talk. He did the whole study and has a huge report. So he's the culprit of me preaching these ideas now. And on the regulatory side, I will simply say that it's not the first time. We dealt with financial crisis, Tony, you mentioned. You know, financial regulators were way behind. You know, what they were regulating, they had no idea what they were regulating, and we ended up in the crisis. So it's not the first time that we have faced with something that moves very fast. As a decision makers, we come and we follow and we see what we can do. The question that I would even ask to you is, do we do anything about it or not? Like in Italy, they said, okay, forget the ChatGPT, let us think first before we say go and use it. Or we just let it go and we see if it does bad things to us. The answer probably is in between, because what the artificial intelligence has been created for and is being mainstream to used for, what is the purpose? It's definitely not to bring more sustainability or fairness or make us more efficient. I'm sure they were designed in Silicon Valley with a completely different objective. So as regulators, we need to nudge or give certain incentives to ensure that the new systems, the artificial intelligence delivers what you, as representing the people, would want them to do.
Thank you, Yolita. If I'm right, I think Rodrigo, did you want to come in and make some remarks? Rodrigo.
Your first answer, the first question I like to answer. And the second question too. I'm a politician, I'm a parliamentarian, and I want to continue in Parliament. So I'm sure that this kind of issues, long-term, future, is going to be in the center of the agenda, because future now is very short, not on the long term, not just at the long term future, because the accelerator of changes, the future is tomorrow or in 10 hours. So ChatGPT is a very good example. 2 months change the debate, the public debate. So I'm working in this issue because I convince the people, the citizens, are willing to to vote to compensate the politicians who try to face these kind of issues. But it's not easy issue. Is you have to study, you have to work. And the other key is the Committee of the Future. We are working in this kind of Committee of the Future in the Parliament and this kind of World Summit of the Committee of the Future because I think it contributes to put in the center of the agenda this kind of issue that we are sure, we are convinced that is very important, the relevance of that to the society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. We have another intervention coming from the audience. Just introduce yourself and then off you go.
My name is Miroslav Grigoric. I'm from Slovenian Parliament. I was listening our moderator who said that we have many competing demands now and in the future, where to spend the money. And I was, of course, impressed by the statement of Mrs. Lolita Budke-Viecene from JRC, that science has to be part of the society and that evidence-based policy is needed. So my question to the panelists is, what is your opinion about the following facts? When Soviet Union surprised the whole world in October '57 with launching the Sputnik, the first reaction of US government was to immediately start spending 3% of GDP on federal research. If you look at the curve of China spending for science technology, now they are at 2.5, but the curve goes on. We don't know what will be next year. Education in China comprises 14%, cost for education in China costs 14% of national budget. And also we are hearing that we constantly lack education in the STEM area, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. So I know about the EU CHIPS Act, 50 million, which doesn't match the US 43 million plus $260 billion. I am aware of EU hydrogen initiative and maybe some others, but my question is, how much should we really put into science, into education? And also we are aware now that the fact in Europe is that we are going to spend about plus minus 2% GDP for defense. So what is the opinion of the panel on this? Thank you very much.
I think I'm going to put that question or set of questions to Virginius, if I may. Would you like to have a go at answering that?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much for this question. I won't tell you how much because, you know, it's always difficult to estimate the exact amount. But I think what's very clear that, you know, the education and of course science and research is the basically fundament, the most important foundation of our society. And when you look at the EU level, I think, you know, very often it comes, to be honest, not to the amounts that we spend, but how we spend them, and are they put to the best of uses? And it goes from, you know, all the way up the ladder, from the education to of course, research and innovation. I think with the years and with our new Horizon programs, and especially what was extremely beneficial is orienting into missions. So basically having a mission approach with a concrete goals, what we want to reach, has helped a lot. I think what was tremendously huge achievements that under Horizon program we have managed to unite best and brightest into different projects. We have managed to increase significantly synergies between the private sector and the science, which not always there is an understanding of how it functions. Nevertheless, of course, we are meeting many challenges, but I really don't believe that, matching the amounts will help there. I think, we have to use much better the infrastructure that we have. We have to ensure that we don't have this two speeds Europe, where, part of the Europe has a slightly different approach or approach which does not bring the results that we would wish to have across the EU, and that can help us, of course, tremendously move forward. Even your mentioned military, for example, capabilities. We know that many of dual-use technologies, at some point they were first of all used by civil society and then moved up to a military, or vice versa. But the very last point, I think what's extremely important is also competition for talents. Because, without a strategy for competing for the talents globally, without being a center for attracting talents, it's going to be, of course, very difficult. If we will have our best and brightest living across the ocean or living to other parts of the world. So it's always full of challenges, but I don't think so it ends up only with the amount in the budget that you have put.
Yes, thank you, Virginijus. I mean, if I could add one or two thoughts of my own there, I think one thing that would help, at least in the European context, would be deeper and more liquid and more efficient capital markets. I can't remember when the plan to build a genuine capital markets union was first launched, but I mean, it's still going on now. The other thing is, of course, the completion of the single market. That would help as well. And that, I think, stretches back into 2 decades or more. So, anyone else want to offer some thoughts on that last point? I think, yes, Sophie.
I wanted to just pick up really on the points on the importance of the education system, and I suppose that in many cases we have not focused on increasing, or there's been relatively poor attempts in terms of increasing education in STEM, and that is perhaps as failing to take a long-term view. It's very difficult to get teachers in STEM. We still have inequalities in STEM and so on. But actually, I think the future requires us to think about education in a fundamentally different way. What we're trying to do is to embed current thinking in a system which is going to need to completely change in the future. So our response, for example, to STEM has been, for many countries, to embed coding as lessons in schools. And actually, what has happened in terms of the pace of the technological revolution is coding, knowing how to code, will very quickly be completely obsolete, because the language of coding is now English, because you just need to ask ChatGPT to code something for you. If we think about the way in which we're trying to deal now with ChatGPT in respect of our education system, and we're all in a panic about how students might be able to get ChatGPT to write their essays for them, and we're trying to shut that down in ways, actually that's completely the wrong thing to do. It's not going away, and that's actually what we should be saying is our education system and the way in which we assess young people through regurgitating knowledge in essays and in exams was not fit for purpose before, and it's not going to be fit for purpose in the future. So I think the challenge that I put back is, you know, it's not about small fixes in a system. The way in which the world is changing in terms of technology requires us to fundamentally rethink that system. The question is, are we brave enough to do that? Do we have the right skills to do that? And how actually are we engaging our younger people who are far more adept at these things than most of us in this room in actually bringing that knowledge to bear on those wholesale system changes that need to happen?
Thank you, Sophie. Anyone else want to add something? Okay, Jolita.
Apologies, I just want to do a small pitch. Just think, we will be launching next week, but I really like to invite you also to reflect. We'll be launching a Futures Capacity Building. Sounds boring. What we will be doing is Futures School Initiative, where we will present 20 lessons for young people, citizens, teachers to really think about the futures, to bring into the school, not talking about this specific skills, but to really sit and think about pathways towards the future.
Thank you, Elisa. We have a question over here. Well, I'm going to go here first.
Jan Briers, a member of the Belgian Parliament. It's clear that the EU has a much more progressive idea on climate change and on what we should do on it than most of our national parliaments. So it's very important that we have the EU to convince all of us to work on that. A few months ago, I was here on the same spot for the NATO Parliament. And I was thinking, why shouldn't we convince also the members of the NATO Parliament to work on, like we work today, on the Future Generations Act, on long-term solutions? Shouldn't we all convince our representatives in NATO to also work on that? I mean, what I felt, the terrible war in Ukraine brought us all together. Americans, Europeans and other partners of NATO. Let us use NATO for more peace and also for our future generations.
Thank you very much. Now, we have got a request from Daniela Tilsbury to join from Gibraltar. So if you are there, Daniela. Just waiting for the connection to be made. Here we are. Can you hear us okay? Well, while we wait for Daniela to try and make that connection, we have a question or remark from this side of the audience. Go ahead.
Microphone. Sorry, sir. Microphone.
Vera, you mentioned that only democracies can deliver the green transition. Autocracies won't do it, I agree. But what about all these multinational companies who are completely beyond the control of states? Most of them are bigger than states. And in the context of food, how are we going to persuade our citizens that what they want is clean food, not the rubbish that the multinationals peddle, because that's more profitable and more addictive?
Thank you. I'm more than happy to admit that I don't really have any answers to that. I mean, I think we're tackling the same question when it comes to the contamination of our information environment with big tech. That how do we tackle the question of accountability when these big technology communication structures have become part of our democratic infrastructure, and they don't have any accountability. So I obviously know that the European Union is putting through a lot of legislation. Some of it works, and some of it works partly. So it comes, at the end of the day, it comes down and back to educating our citizens. And we're not talking about only children, but also our adult population, that the choices that they make in their everyday lives as consumers are societal choices as well. And I believe that was Professor Hashimoto yesterday pointed out that we really need to move from the consumer citizen back to the informed citizen, and this has been addressed in the panel as well. Thank you for the question.
Okay, let's see if we can make a connection with Daniela in Gibraltar this time.
Hello, can you hear me?
Extremely well.
Oh, fantastic. I had raised my hand in relation to a few questions earlier, but I shall try and make a connection with what has just been said and the previous question. I think most important for us in terms of progressing this long-term thinking agenda and the future generations agenda is to acknowledge that our education and our science systems are failing us. And if we acknowledge that, and we acknowledge that they are part of the problem as well as part of the solution, then we are going to be making inroads with this bigger, broader ambition. Let me explain that a little further. We have the Greta generation that know a great deal thanks to the science that has been very informative, a science that has provided a lot of knowledge, but a complete lack of capability. Education equally is testing, assessing how much our students, our young people know, but not how much they can do or how much they can change. And I think this is a massive problem globally. If we want to aspire to the sorts of changes we're talking about, if we want to have a NATO that is not just aware, but capable of engaging a population to make the changes that we are desiring, we need to switch the way we are utilizing and engaging our scientists and our educators. We do not need to know so much more. We need to know only how to be able to change. We don't need to just be aware. We need to be able to engage. And we do not have the skills, the capabilities to take this transition forward. What we keep investing is in understanding the issues, the scientific issues, which is of course important, but we don't equally invest in parallel to understanding how this transition can take place, how we give capability and skills to our young people, to our professionals, to our governments, to be able to change the way that we live and learn and work. Then we're going to be stuck in this paradigm for the rest of our lives, and unfortunately for those who are yet to come. So let me give you a very tangible example. Earlier, there was a discussion about finance, and there was a suggestion about the importance of capital investments in major projects. But we are needing to embed finance and financial changes to our education and science systems in a different way. In Gibraltar, when we developed new schools, we didn't just develop new schools that would meet the needs of our students in the traditional academic sense, but we looked at how we embed the principles of future generations' well-being in the design and development of these schools so that they create opportunities, not just to learn to know, but to learn to do, to learn to live, to learn to be. So the schools in themselves encapsulate a philosophy of it's not just enough to know, you need to live it. And the lived experience in education and the lived experience in science is just as important as the outcomes associated with learning to know. And for me, it's quite critical that we understand that transitions towards more safer, brighter, sustainable futures cannot come unless we tackle that really hard question associated with acknowledging that our education systems and our science systems are failing us as a society.
Well, that's certainly some sobering thoughts to conclude with, Daniela. We are pretty much at the end there. Does anybody wish to make one final contribution? Yes, we do, over here.
Thanks. Sarah Boyack from the Scottish Parliament. There's been lots of really good, buzzy conversations over the last couple of days. So it's the challenge to all of us as to how we implement this, not just with future money, but how do we get the current money we're spending politically to deliver for the future generations now, and how we use the energy and the networking to actually make this happen. That's my question. Thanks.
Okay, I think I might just, to wrap it up, go to the first of our panelists, Klaus.
I think wrapping it up will be a little bit difficult. If I could just say the following, because we have also been discussing about parliaments and parliamentarism in this setup. I know that parliaments are normally not very popular with executives and sometimes also not with experts. And they are not very popular because they're professionals and they're able to control. And they're even better able to control if they have the means, the resources, the expertise, and the tools at their hands to fulfill that job of control. Therefore, my belief is that, yes, we need to consult with citizens, and we've been successfully doing so in preparation now on the Future of Europe process. But we shouldn't go back to a situation where basically governments are meeting once or twice a year with selected citizens, and then they do as they like, as it's the case in Shura Council setups in the Arab world. We need strong parliaments, we need efficient parliaments, we need professional parliaments, and citizens, of course, have to come into there. But without parliamentarism, no democracy.
Very good. Thank you very much, Klaus. Well, I think that pretty much concludes the session for this morning. So I'm going to say farewell and hand you all over to the capable hands of our organizers. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tony. Let me announce the brief technical break for 15 minutes, and we'll start the last hour session at 13:15. So, dear colleagues, please take your seats. So let us move on the closing part of our Congress. It was a very intense and incredibly productive day and a half. Thank you for generous sharing of your experience and insights. Now we will devote the last academic hour of our event to its summing up. Since nobody could physically attend each parallel sessions, which we had tomorrow morning, we asked the moderators of our Congress sessions to share their general comments first. But before that, I would like to open the floor for a couple of sentences for Margaret and Duarte. So first, Margaret, because she needs to leave us. You could speak actually from...
Thank you very much, Mr. Lopata. And I would like to say, first of all, thank you to the organizer for this interesting conference, and also thank you to the Lithuanian Parliament for hosting the future of the world. And then I would just like to say a few words. I think it has been very important to be here as a parliamentarian, to meet with the Ukrainians and listen to their perspective. And also, it makes it very clear that the solution of the war, it involves the Ukrainians. No more, no less. The Ukrainians need to be involved. But also the unity, that we stand united. Another thing is that we are here, parliamentarians from Uruguay, from New Zealand, from Europe, from international organizations, and I think this is also very, very good. It shows that we have common issues, even if we tackle them a little bit different, because we are from our national systems, we have different constitutions, different traditions. And when it comes to the future, I think there are some common values that's always important if we are talking about parliamentarism, if we are talking about democracy, rule of law, international law, peace and stability. And that is exactly what I said. If we are talking about democracy, there need to be the rule of law, there need to be international law, peace, stability. There are new threats and we need to tackle them. And I think it's good with all what we have listening here to foresee the future, to have discussions on the future. But I would also like to say that what Klaus well said, without parliamentarians, no democracy. And I think this is a perspective that we need always to involve and include. And one thing I have thought about yesterday, listening to all the brave people who are fighting for democracy, is also the need for us who come from democratic countries to stay united behind them and continue our work, but also to remember them. And I would say thank you very much, Emmanuel Singiris, for your work. You are one of those who stood in the front line when Lithuania went to be a democracy. And I think we own you, all of us, also to remember what you have done, but also that you continue to strive for democracy. And now one of the leaders, when it comes to Vladimir Kara-Murza, the support for him. And I think also, when I started with the report of my report for the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, your report from Council of Europe was already presented. And it shows that we as parliamentarians with our tools also can do a lot. So thank you for your work and that you are still striving for democracy. I say this because for us who come from a democratic country, We are not the one who are taking the fight. We are just speaking. We are very safe when we go back home. But those who are doing the fight, they need to know also that there are support from democratic countries. What I also would like to say that the unity and the international cooperation is very important. Going back to history, I am from Sweden, a Swedish parliamentarian. We have lived in peace for a very long time. But 1719 to 1721, we were a country attacked by Russia. And we managed to get respect for our territory just because of international cooperation. Even United Kingdom at that time were there to support us. And this shows also the need to continue our support for Ukraine. And I stop here because I know that there is a lot of speech that are going to be made. And thank you once again. And I think the future perspective is very relevant and it's need to continue. And thank you to Uruguay as well, who already have invited for the next conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and for your optimism as well. Everyone else, please come. You'll be seated here. Okay, Mr. Duarte.
Mr. Chair, dear colleagues, of course, the first word is to say thank you to the organization, to the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania, to the speaker, to our colleagues, and allow me to say to you, Mr. Lopata, because nothing will fall from the sky. If you are here, it's because you did a great job. Thank you for your commitment to organize this event. And for me, it was very interesting to see parliamentarians from different countries and from different regions of the world came together not to discuss the problems of today, but to discuss the future of the world. Because yes, we are politicians and sometimes we don't have time to discuss the future because we have so many problems that need to be solved today, yesterday, and we don't have time to make a reflection about the real problems that will affect us in the future. But it happened here during these 2 days. And this is completely different from many other conferences that I have been. And so we identified that how relevant is multilateralism, that is different crises that need to be solved, that democracy also is affected, and how democracy can be strong and survive in this world. How the geopolitics was affected with new powers and with this war and this invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and how it affects all of us. How relevant is to give opportunity to the citizens. How is important to have sustainable development for all, because this is, in the end of the day, the more important task of politicians, to give sustainable development to the people we represent. And so, I just needed to say it was a very productive 2 days of work. I believe it will be one more step until the final conference that will happen next year. And from here, it was very important to say very loud, the parliamentarian dimension to shape the future of the world is essential, because we represent the people of the world. And we need to continue, and our governments need to also to understand that. The dimension, parliamentary dimension, is essential in this definition of the future of the world. Thank you very much for your work.
Thank you, President. And now we are moving to our moderators. Unfortunately, plenary session number 1, unfortunately, Jovita, Vice Minister of Lithuania, was unable to attend, but I asked Mr. Zaid to summarize briefly.
Thank you so much. You've thrust me into this with fairly short notice. For all those whose views I won't reflect or can't reflect, please forgive me. I think the upshot of the first panel was that Ukraine is the principal barrier, the principal barricade in defense of liberal democracy, and the fate of Lithuania is directly connected to it. There is a sense, of course, of deep anxiety in this country. The parliament is seized, the people are seized, and for very good reason, and not just in this part of Europe, but of course for much of Europe. The sense that the ferocious attack on the people of Ukraine, its institutions and territory, has created a reaction of a phenomenal sacrifice. The resilience of the Ukrainian people, the willingness of its parliament to continue operating, the rebuilding of infrastructure the day the destruction takes place almost, is a testimony to the willingness of people to fight for democracies. And I think Alexander Kornienko's participation was hugely moving in that first session. To a certain extent, much in Europe now is subordinated to the rolling back of the Russian aggression and the need, of course, to see that criminal accountability is joined and the leadership of the Russian Federation is held to account in a criminal proceeding to come. There is also a dying, or let's say, an annoying sense that populism in all its expressions remains a poison, is there to provide an avenue for those who want to undermine liberal democracies, an easy path to it. Finance, of course, would be deeply required, and Ukraine offers a huge opportunity for investors. There was, of course, comment, and this is well accepted, that the continuation of the efforts by the authorities to clean up corrupt practices in Ukraine must continue. But ultimately, I think out of all of what we heard that first session, it's the need for moral consistency and for a recognition of the deep sacrifices of the Ukrainian people and what it means for the need on the part of the rest of us, as Margaret just said, to defend democracy robustly. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaid. Then plenary session number 2, the future of democracy. Emanuelis.
Yes, that was heartbreaking. Heartbreaking. Margaret, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for what it was done by you in chairmanship of OSCE. So for your years and years defending democracy in OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. Thank you for that. And of course, Mr. Pacheco, for you the same. You have even more like European Security Organization. You behind, you have 180 countries. 180 countries. Last resolutions, even not after the 24th of February, even before Russian attack, you changed all Latin American, African behaviors inside of your organization. Thank you for that in the name of all people who have no colonialistic ideas about influences in Latin America and Africa, but have the equal feeling of brotherhood. But they were, because of you, they were out from manipulation of dictatorial states, the parliamentary APU union. Thank you for that so much. So now I would like to say a few words more about how it works. Friends, I look to Paul Massaro. Paul, if it will be possible to make a hearing, if you're talking about Ukrainian terrible, terrible attack of Russia, of war of aggression of Ukraine, Paul, If we can have hearings in the Helsinki Committee in the Congress related to the issue of avoiding sanctions, they're making fun from us, you know, China and Russia, about our sanctions against Russia. Making fun, well, all people who try to make money are avoiding sanctions through always trying to avoid the sanctions. Simply to publish the catalog of firms who are avoiding the sanctions, having the hearing on the Capitol Hill will be a great idea, and we will be supported by all of us to stop them to make jokes from our democratic world and from our sanctions against Russia. So it probably will be a good idea. Third one, how democracy in function. Raimundas, I would like to say 1960s, 1960. Can you imagine Danish delegation to Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly, Consultative Parliamentary Assembly, make a resolution supported by all of us, 1960, that Council of Europe is not recognizing the occupation of the Baltic states. Can you imagine the feeling in Vilnius, Riga, Tallinn, when we heard that Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly voted that the Soviet illegal rule after Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, illegal pact, is not recognized by the Council of Europe, or Otto von Habsburg resolution 1982 in European Parliament, parliamentary resolution, not recognizing the Baltic belongingness to the Soviet realities against the occupation. So the same now is feeling in Kiev. The time in Kiev, Raimundas, is ticking, all world is, the time is ticking. We have no Paris time, no time in London, no time in Washington, is a Kiev time. So time in Kiev is demanding from us actions on parliamentary level, better governance of our democracies, better shape, but at the same time actions. We will not let, Raimundas, that Ukraine will be on the second page of newspapers, second rank, and we will try to achieve the level of special tribunal established in the world with your support. So we encourage you to support your legislation. It was done, you heard from Michael Kaminsky and from all those heroes that in some countries we started to invite people support NATO future membership of Ukraine, and at the same time Russian Democrats, Nobel Prize winners, people who are in jail, were asking you about second stage, about support to Russia changes in the future inside. Not let us give the chance for Putin to transfer Russia to typical Hitler type or Mussolini type dictatorship. Let's support the best Russian people who are in jail, and let's support Democrats inside of Russia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Let's go to the parallel sessions, which were devoted to embedding futures in parliamentary practice. Session, let's name it session number 1, Foresight, a practical tool for anticipatory governance. So Mario Damen, please, Mario.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. That was, I would say, a good working session. So we had a discussion on how to implement foresight in a practical government situation. We had 5 presentations from Lithuania, the host country, on their Vision 2050 and how that will flow over into the policies about to be presented in the summer, as I understood. We had a view from Chile, the other part of the world, how the Senate there cooperates with people from science and universities to do foresight. We had 2 presentations from the EU, in particular the European Parliament, how we there try to work on risks and define risks, and also on how to break down silos between the institutions in informal processes. That was a very important element. And finally, we had a presentation from the OECD, who have a concrete toolkit that they present all around the world on how to do foresight so that people can learn to do it themselves. If I would sum up that whole short discussion that we had, that was very fruitful, I would say 3 words. It is about people. It is a process between people, bringing them together and then let them look forward. The second word is it's about building a vision. So there was the image of walking up a hill to make scenarios, and when you have this far view of the scenarios, then walk down the hill again to come to the policy implementation. And the third expression I would say is inspire the policies, because we don't make the scenarios to have scenarios and certainly not to predict, but the scenarios are there then to inspire the politicians and the people who make the policies to take the right decisions. So these were very practical conclusions from, I think, a fruitful working session.
Thank you. For session number 2, Geopolitics of Long-Term Sustainability. Ms. Elizabeth Ders. Elizabeth, are you?
Yes, I'm over here.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And also, I just wanted to extend my thanks to you all for hosting and organizing, and for everyone for fruitful participation and discussions in our parallel session and also over the last days. Our panel, or our parallel session, had a bit the interesting perspective that while the other parallel sessions where we're looking on perhaps tools or processes for thinking about long-term, bringing long-term into policymaking, we were looking at a specific challenge, so the challenge of sustainability and what this means when we look at the long-term transition pathway towards sustainability globally, but also nationally. We also had the benefit of having quite a global perspective from panelists from New Zealand to the UK to Slovenia to here in Lithuania, and this meant that we had, or maybe I had, the challenge of bringing together quite a lot of different perspectives and different aspects of the long-term sustainability challenge. The session was divided into 2 rough focus areas. The first was around the challenges that we face around this, and discussion points around the challenges for supply chains, the financial gap for financing the sustainability transition, energy security, risk preparedness, and of course, environmental impacts, whether this be around too much or too little water, whether this be around our biodiversity needs and the way that our economy depends on this. We covered a lot of this in the first discussion, and they all point towards the crucial role of long-term strategic thinking to be a core part of our policymaking and our political processes. And for that, we need governance innovations. Luckily, many of you around the room are already working on this, so fantastic. But we also shifted gears to talk in the second half of the session about what are some of these governance innovations, what are some of these solutions. And there was a crucial point around possibilities to learn from the private sector. This includes both the private sector's capability to have risk preparedness, the way that they might be agile and responsive, as Taylor was mentioning in the panel earlier, as well as the private sector's techniques around linking financial or linking investment to impact goals, and how we can align, for example, financial flows with climate targets, with biodiversity targets, to enable the quality of finance, both public and private, as well as the amount that we need to face the challenge of the sustainability transition. And lastly, we talked a bit about governance dimensions, and this is where I would also perhaps bring a bit of my perspective as someone who is not sitting in the parliament seat or within a government, but rather from the outside. I think that there's a lot of innovative work that's happening amongst all of you and around the world on this. And I would just speak to 4 dimensions which came up both in our session and also throughout the last days that I think are important. One connects to the other panel, the parallel session that happened on foresight, and I think there's a lot of excellent work happening at the EU level around this, both to convene member states and build capacities at a member state level on this, but also within the JRC and within Šefčovič's cabinet. So you have my support, congratulations, and I think there's a lot to be done building on this current Commission progress on that. The second is around, or the next steps of that is, of course, how that's integrated into the policy cycle. And many people have commented today, particularly Sophie earlier, around bringing long-term thinking at an earlier stage into the policy cycle. And this is, for me, quite an open question of that. And that's rather a challenge for those who are sitting in ministries or sitting in directorates to think about how they connect to the strong foresight work that might be happening. The second is around metrics, which set a direction of where we are going, and this I would also connect to some of what Sophie had mentioned. There are a number of governments around the world that are working on this that bring different metrics into looking at our success as society, Wales being one of them, Scotland being another one, And there's also work happening at the Commission level on the Transition Performance Index and the Resilience Dashboard, which are trying to look at how we measure long-term success on topics like sustainability, but take an economy-wide perspective. And this is quite important. And I would just signpost to another conference that's happening in another parliament next week, where I will be present along with many other members of our team, that's hosted by the European Parliament, on how the economy shifts beyond growth as a metric of success, as a way of understanding where our economy goes. And this is, of course, a deeply long-term topic. And I will for sure be bringing many of the insights that I heard today and over the last days into that. The second two pieces are deeply connected because they both connect to the political side. One is the absolutely essential role of Parliament, and I can only echo what's been said just before me on this. And I think there's a lot more work to be done, and I personally don't see any reason why every government around the world shouldn't have a committee for the future in their parliament. I personally would also propose that the European Parliament needs this in their next sitting, and that's something that we'll be thinking about further as we approach the next European elections. And the last point is around leadership, and this is perhaps also a call to action to everyone in the room that finds themselves in this position. Some of the discussions that we have and the decisions that we have to make in the future around long-term sustainability, they are difficult decisions, and they're absolutely going to require a lot of courage. It's going to be hard. There's no way around that. And I think having good governance and a diversity of governance practices which support our long-term thinking and bring that into policy making allows for a solid foundation upon which those difficult decisions to be made and upon which all of us to have the courage that's needed to make some of those difficult decisions. And I think that is a responsibility of everyone in this room. That's a responsibility of also many other governments out there. And I would leave that as my final thought from the session. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. As we mentioned yesterday, all materials of the Congress will be published, so they will be available for public as well. So parallel session number 3, it's governance, how to put citizens first. Mario Sharfibilek.
Yes, here. Oh. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and also thanks to the organizers for this extremely interesting last 2 days of discussions. I'm personally a scientist, and I'm not a parliamentarian, but we usually say when we bring evidence to policy, so evidence-informed policy making, that scientists and policymakers need to work together more because we do speak different languages very often, and it's not easy to translate this in a day-to-day business. So I personally learned quite a lot in the last 2 days that I will bring home to our joint research center in the European Commission that we can take into account. Now, I had the pleasure to moderate a wonderful panel on how to put citizens, not only today, but also in the future first. And the first point to be made here was also made by Julita in the panel this morning, namely that people have different perspectives, different values. They are differing in what they want. And if we do not understand them when we design policies, then certainly our policies will not be accepted in the way they are done. And this is an important point because in the last years we've seen technological change that has led us to think of others usually in terms of adversarial engagement, meaning others are wrong, they're misinformed, disinformed, they are the enemy, and that's certainly driven by the way social media is designed and the attention economy and, well, basically driving engagement, but not in a positive sense. And therefore, we talked about several ways of how governance or governments or parliaments can be up to the challenge and task that they solve this and they engage better with citizens. So we heard then from Finland that even their engagement and democratic engagement in general isn't as well as we thought, and that's a huge surprise to me. Usually in the EU we think, you know, Finland is a poster child for many things that they do well. But even there we heard from Vera that, yeah, especially younger generations are disconnecting. They're no longer voting, they're not going out. And it's especially true because around EU policies, they don't really know what's going on. There's not enough transparency, there's not enough discussion, there's not about enough communication around this. And so we need to do better, and we need to be more transparent, more engaging. Then we heard, and this is related to the need to act now, especially on climate change, from Jan next to me, that if we do not act as policymakers, or the policymakers do not get these laws done, then citizens will simply drag policymakers in front of the court, and they will get right, because many things that happen now, or where we lack action, is actually violating human rights. And then we have courts basically forcing policymakers to make decisions that they didn't do themselves, and that is not a good and comfortable situation to be in. So then we heard from the other side, from Sarah, from the Scottish Parliament, on a nice initiative on well-being, sustainable development, and here saying that, well, we have a lot of policies over time now addressing this, and we hear this also from the Commissioner, but very often we may not share the same definition of what we actually mean. We talk about sustainable development. What does it mean? Is there a common framework for that? And I think we work on this on many fronts, but yeah, there's more understanding and more strategic framework needed to align policies, so that not every new policy is doing something different in a different direction and it's not aligned. Then on the other side, not only are there green policies and green transition needed, we've also heard from Alessandro from the Italian Parliament how AI can also be used for positive change, how AI can be used to engage citizens, for example, by automatically translating what's been said in the Parliament, automatically producing transcripts of parliamentary debates so that people can look this up. And there's some promises there, but certainly also some caveats that we need to take into account when using AI in government. And then Modestas showed us here from Lithuania how to bring management science into the parliament. And this was an interesting discussion here, because we think usually, we have much change in how corporations work nowadays. How they bring technology into the production cycle, into interaction. But very often the parliaments are still working the same way they worked in the past. But through COVID times, we've seen change is possible. And we talked just about how AI is possible in Italy. And here, the takeaway was to say, well, we need to have an agile public administration that understands that they are also contributing to the work done in parliaments, that they can help make this better and more efficient and also innovative. So having a different mindset here, for example, through questioning everything we do, no matter on which level, is certainly helpful. And then last but not least, we had Taylor talking about how leadership needs to adapt to this, to the new time and new ways of working and doing policy making, because very often we tell leaders what not to do, but yeah, it's also important to tell them what to do. And here the main takeaway was really we need a change of culture in leadership, in the public administration, in public leadership, in parliaments, of risk-taking, of innovation. We shouldn't be afraid to do new things, to try out new things, and then to evaluate these new things and to see what worked and what didn't work. And we know that it's really hard, and that was a point raised to say, well, the public and the media very often criticizes for the tiniest mistakes that we do, but we need to work on this cultural shift, because otherwise it will never happen. So I think if I want to summarize in 3 points just to conclude this, first of all, we need to take citizens serious with their doubts and fears and values, and not only think, yeah, they're just misinformed, and we need to just get them to know what we're doing. No, we need to take them serious, because otherwise they will take us in front of the court, and they will get the right very often. We need to be more transparent, inclusive, engaging, and that's not always easy, but there are many innovations here. We heard from different participants how this can be done. Parliament is important. Parliament can play an active role in this, and how engaging citizens in their constituency, but also more broadly. And lastly, I already mentioned this, we need this change in the culture of what public service means. We need to be innovative. We need to think about what can we do better, and how can we know what we do better, how can we measure what we do better, and then tell people more of our successes, rather than being driven by the day-to-day agenda in the media. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mario. And despite the fact that we all participated in the last plenary session, number 3, but for short observation, please, Tony.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. There were a number of sensible diagnoses and proposals during this plenary session. There was an emphasis on the need for intelligent risk assessment, risk analysis, something that should be kept free of ideology. There was an emphasis on open, thoughtful discussions, bringing in wide range of voices from across society. That made me think, yeah, we need, that means we need an information space that's unpolluted, you know, kept free of crap. We didn't really discuss that in much detail. Maybe the next Congress will. There was an emphasis on embedding a long-term approach in law so that it can't get tinkered with at every electoral cycle. Trying to ensure that civil servants, public sector planners and workers shouldn't be judged too much by their achievement of short-term targets. There was a talk about planning mechanisms, response mechanisms should be flexible, adaptable, recognizing that laws we drafted 5 years ago might not be entirely appropriate today because they've been overtaken by technological change. There was also a discussion of the need for smart spending at a time when there are strains and pressures on public expenditure from all directions. So spend well, not just in large quantities. And you know, it goes without saying, improved science and education systems. Behind all this, though, there was, I would say, a unanimous consensus that all this should be done, all this long-term approach should be done in a way that is in keeping with the spirit of democracy. What we didn't really address that comes out of that, though, is, well, if you do it in a fully democratic way, how do you make sure that these democratic discussions are in a sense kept kind of depoliticized so that the intelligent long-term planning doesn't get contaminated by political competition? This is the problem, because if certain parts of society do feel that they're excluded from a green transition, well, they will want their voices to be heard in the political process, and that in turn can affect the organization of long-term planning. There is a tension, in other words, between planning for the long term and the pressures of day-to-day politics. Finally, there was a reference made to the need to ensure that the long-term green transition shouldn't endanger, in Europe at least, this particular model of welfare state capitalism that has proved so popular since roughly the end of the Second World War. But of course, to ensure the sustainability of that welfare state capitalist model, you're going to need economic growth. So the economic growth, you've got to make sure that's compatible with this transition to greens. There's a potential tension there as well that needs to be thought through. But it was a very fruitful discussion, and it rounded off the talking parts of the Congress very nicely.
Thank you, Tony. And now Sophie. Sophie has agreed to accept the challenge and to make some kind of the concluding speech of the Congress. So please, Sophie.
Thank you. I was asked to try and summarise the last 2 days, so I'll do my best at that. Clearly yesterday, a huge discussion on the future of democracy, and it was very clear that Ukraine winning the war is very much about the future of democracy. Some insights coming from a number of contributors on whether we could have predicted what we're now seeing earlier, whether we should have intervened earlier, and parallels made to that in respect of other challenge that we're currently facing, where perhaps we haven't intervened as early as we could, or haven't prevented things, or perhaps in some cases might have been willfully blind to some of the things that are coming down the track at us. So things like climate change has been writ large in the discussions over the last few days. Biodiversity loss, the fact that 70% of nature in the world has disappeared. The threats posed by AI, wealth inequality, and polarization, which is often accelerated by misinformation and disinformation. And therefore, all of these are challenges that we're facing which necessitate politicians to be brave in taking a long-term view. And I was quite struck by one quote from a panellist yesterday where he said, "We are weighed down by human struggles whilst nature turns on us. Pandering to basic instincts to win votes is lamentable and stupid in the extreme, and in the end it will be self-defeating." And he's absolutely right, of course, but the challenges of actually shifting that are very, very difficult. We talked a lot about our systems, and certainly throughout the discussions that have been fed back from the breakout sessions, we're all doing different pieces of work on embedding long-term thinking, using foresight, trying to contribute to a series of goals, but it doesn't appear to be completely systematic in everything that we do, from the top of the system in terms of our politicians, out there in terms of how the media are describing the way in which we need to act, and then embedded right through our systems of governance in terms of how our government and public officials are acting and what skills and capacity they have to do, that they have to act. So some real challenges there in making a kind of real systematic approach. We spoke a lot during the breakout sessions and themes that have come up here in the plenaries around the importance of involving citizens. Yesterday we heard a case for creating a new form of citizen governance. There's a consensus that we cannot possibly achieve the long-term goals that we need to achieve and achieve those in a fair way and in a just way unless we involve citizens. And I particularly liked a quote, which I'm trying to find it now, which was something along the lines, it was the lady here, I think, who was talking about, I would sort of describe it as citizens are their own experts. So it's something about everyone being on the same level, or everyone is as intelligent as each other. And sometimes I think we forget that. And we turn to academia or subject matter experts, but we forget that people are their own experts in their own lives. And actually, all of us in this room, our purpose for being here is to make citizens' lives better. So if we're not asking the citizens themselves what that looks like, how can we possibly do that? So there's something about really building that in. And I think there's certainly something about having a focus on young people when we do that, because young people are experiencing the world in a completely different way to the way that we experience it. They are digital natives. Most of us, I'll probably give the exception of maybe 5 or 6 of us in this room, are probably not digital natives. We're perhaps struggling to keep up with technology, learning as we go, but it's not been a part of our everyday lives. We probably don't experience climate anxiety in the same way that our young people are experiencing it. We have different, we've grown up in different ways with views around identity. We're perhaps not experiencing mental health challenges in the same way that our younger generations are experiencing them. And so it's critically important that we are listening to that next generation voice, something which I wanted to mention earlier, which we did in Wales was to set up a Future Generations Leadership Academy, where we identified young leaders between the ages of 18 to 30, put them through a big leadership programme on what does leading for future generations look like, and a range of other things. But the best thing that we did was actually pair those young leaders with existing leaders, for those young leaders to mentor existing leaders in a reverse mentoring programme. Usually what we get is older, more experienced people imparting their wisdom and knowledge on young people, and that can be important, but actually what we need is young people imparting their wisdom and knowledge on current leaders. Because they are experiencing things in a completely different way. As a result of that programme, and our young leaders were reverse mentoring the head of our Welsh Government Civil Service, chief executives of our local authority, the chief executive of our Football Association. We now have young people embedded on the board of the Welsh Government as a result of that reverse mentoring. We have a Football Association who's adopted a sustainability strategy to become the most sustainable football association in the world. And a couple of months ago, I bumped into a chief executive who said, although the programme had come to an end, because it's a year for each programme, he is actually continuing with his young mentor, paying her to be his mentor because of the value that she brings and the insight that she brings to the decisions that he needs to take. So I think we need to be thinking about some of those different ways. And of course, we've heard some really good other examples of ways that we might do that through citizens panels, deliberative democracy, national conversations, and so on. And we need to make sure that we are viewing that not just as happening in an ad hoc way or happening as an innovation, but that that is actually baked into the way that we do policy making and the way that we do governance. So it's seen as critical to policy development, not as a nice to have. And so that every new major policy we are baking in right from the beginning citizen involvement. And also, I think that there's a huge case for baking in right at the policy, beginning of a policy process, ways in which we best communicate with people, ways in which we need to be taking into account disinformation which might be happening out there. Because on all of those big global threats that we've talked about, on climate, on the war in Ukraine, on AI, on inequality and so on, disinformation is making those challenges even more difficult to experience, and we need to recognise that in itself as one of the biggest threats and be acting on that earlier. The final area then, of course, is around foresight and the use of tools for anticipatory governance. We talked a lot about many good examples where this is happening, but again, the common theme here is perhaps a struggle to fully embed it in our policy making cycles. And again, I'm really struck and agree with points that were made in that, yes, we need access to information. We need to be looking at what science is telling us. We need to be getting information about potential solutions. But in some ways, that's not the most challenging thing. There is a plethora of information out there, which we need to seek for some of it. We need to know where to find it. But there's also a plethora of information which we know about. It's just that we're not acting on it. And that's because we don't have the skills, capabilities and capacities in our system to do that. So we need to make sure that that capacity in foresight is embedded in our political thinking, in our government officials, in our systems and structures, but also that we are working to challenge the extent to which the media are considering those issues, and also seeking to upskill our citizens to be future literate. So I think the final point that I want to make is there was very little disagreement in all of the issues, challenges and potential solutions that we've talked about over the last few days. We all agree what needs to be done. We're all doing it in part. There's a challenge of doing that not just in part, but as a whole system. And the challenge now is for us to get on and do that. I know that there is lots of requests for opportunities for us to engage with each other in a continual way, so that we haven't just come to this conference, made connections and so on and go away, but actually that we want to share that continual dialogue. So I would really encourage you, if it was simple enough to send out a contact list without GDPR implications, that would be great, but sadly it's not that simple. So I would encourage you to make sure you are exchanging business cards, email addresses, LinkedIn profiles. I'm certainly have been stalking a few of you on LinkedIn, and I'd love to hear from many more of you, because I will be continuing this Futures Dialogue in the work that I do, and I think there's a real appetite for us all to do the same. So thank you very much, and diolch yn fawr, as we say in Wales.
Thank you, Sophia. I guess it would be, I mean, your speech could be treated as some kind of general picture atmosphere of the Congress. Let me now suggest to move on adopting our Congress joint statement with your approval. First of all, I would like to thank all of those who have submitted their comments on the draft statement. I would like to inform you that yesterday we have the meeting of the head of delegations where we approved some amendments. And of course, democratic question, probably would anyone like to make an amendment after today's discussion? If not, my proposal is to adopt the statement by consensus. Okay, thank you.
So I think we should think about this new innovation done in Helsinki by the future committees. And I think that the future committee movement established in most of countries and should be established in the more, led in our parliament by Raimondas. We should applaud the future committee and his chairman first for creating the new movement and amending in the future the more effective functions of our institutions, parliamentary institutions, and recommendations will be created by the movement of the future committees. First of all, I would like to say to you, Raimondas, thank you so much being in your capacity like a chairman of future committee. And if you allow me, I will express our support for the movement. And now I would like to say that our good friend, let's use old-fashioned name, freedom fighter, André Gattolin. He spent years and years, André, in Paris, actually opposing even your leader of your Emmanuel Macron party and making enough critical remarks against the leadership, but in being one of the leader of the moral face of France. So you told me just a few minutes ago that you're living after years and years being political face of liberal France. We would like to say thank you for all your contribution, André, during the last years for the moral leadership, not letting French face to be among the other faces, but leading us in our critical view of liberal democracy. Thank you, Andrea.
So we're approaching the end of official program of the Congress. On behalf of the hosts, let me say that the Congress, to our minds, has been a success. We believe that we have achieved its main objectives by taking a focused look at the challenges posed by the future development of the world to today's parliaments. We have also refined an understanding that in order to deal with the challenges, it's necessary to strengthen the principle of anticipatory government in parliaments and governments empowered by these parliaments. Valuable conclusions and insights have been presented on the main specific issues discussed at the Congress, namely ensuring peace, just as the rule of law, strengthening of the foundation of democracy, and so on and so on. I hope that these insights will enrich the experience of all Congress participants and will further spread with the help of our joint statement. These insights will also form one of the cornerstones in the preparations of the upcoming Global Summit of the future organized by the United Nations in 2024. As we discussed at the Congress, our parliaments need to be more actively involved in drafting the decisions for this summit. And once again, I thank all the keynote speakers, all the participants, moderators, and distinguished guests. May I wish you to have a safe trip home. We will be looking, of course, forward to meeting you again right now in Montevideo, Uruguay, in a couple of months. And let me declare that the Global Parliamentary Congress, the future of the world, closed. And now lunch as the place as yesterday. Thank you very much.